Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Yasmin, but everybody calls me Yaya, and on my channel I talk about things that are overlooked or misunderstood in history and current events, and I talk about them while I do my makeup. I do not pretend to be an expert in history or world affairs or in makeup, but I do enjoy all of those things and I enjoy sharing them with you. So without further ado, let's get into our topic for today's video. Today we are talking about South Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, most people know that the United States was a huge perpetrator of violence in Vietnam for about 20 years, but many do not know that South Korea was actually involved as well. Between 1964 and 1973, South Korea deployed over 350,000 troops into South Vietnam, and the South Korean military presence was the second largest military presence in Vietnam after the United States. Now, the decision to deploy this many troops into South Vietnam was both a strategic one for South Korea's political interests, as well as a result of their political allyship with the United States. In fact, it was actually South Korea that volunteered to send troops into Vietnam because of their anti-communist stance and their support for the United States. South Korean leaders were also concerned with the security of their borders because if they didn't send troops, then American troops were going to be moved from South Korea into Vietnam. So the South Korean leadership decided to take matters into their own hands and send their own troops so that the American troops can stay protecting South Korea. Now, during their deployment into Vietnam, the South Korean troops were responsible for many massacres, including one of the most famous or most documented ones, known as the Phong Ni or Phong Nai massacre. This massacre happened in February of 1968, and it killed anywhere between 69 to 79 civilians, and it involved the rounding up of civilians and shooting them. Most of the civilians or villagers were women and children, and this massacre was part of a pattern of violence that was inflicted by these South Korean troops in the Vietnam War. The impact of these massacres include deep scars that Vietnamese victims and their families still hold to this day, along with the traumatic memories of the unfolding of the Vietnam War. Now, this was a massacre that was documented and that we know of. There are likely many more instances of violence that we don't know much about because they haven't been well documented. Now, during the Vietnam War, most international media did not focus on South Korean involvement in this war because most of them just focused on America's involvement. Now, geopolitical alliances of the involved parties influenced international media, and they contributed to the reporting or underreporting of the massacres in Vietnam. At the time, there was also limited access to military documents from the United States and South Korea, and to this day, some of these documents are still classified. Now, in the years following the Vietnam War, more information about South Korean involvement in the war began to surface, and they relied on testimonies and documentation to piece together a full picture of what actually happened. This documentation process was complicated by factors like verifying these survivors' testimonies and their contradictions to what officials say, along with the political sensitivities surrounding the relationships between South Korea, Vietnam, and the United States. Now, some more reasons most people don't recognize South Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War include most narratives that we learn about were intentionally constructed to leave out certain information, which intentionally omits certain events that do not align with dominant political or cultural beliefs. And most stories that dominate the historical discourse often focus on the perspective and the experiences of the victors of these events or the people in power. Limited or biased documentation of these massacres also influence the discourse and information we can gather surrounding these massacres, and they contribute to the lack of visibility or knowledge of those involved. Not to mention the way that these events are taught in education also influence the discourse surrounding what happened and how many people actually know about it. Now, as of today, some South Korean dramas highlight the information regarding their involvement in the Vietnam War. However, in formal South Korean education, Korean involvement of the massacres of Vietnamese civilians is not formally discussed. Now, there have been efforts to reconcile, and there have been official acknowledgments by South Korean leaders regarding their involvement of the massacres in the Vietnam War. In 2023, a South Korean leader acknowledged formally South Korea's involvement in the massacres of civilians during the Vietnam War, which was the first time that the South Korean government ever made such an acknowledgement, and some say that this could pave the way for further acknowledgement by South Korean officials. In recent years, there has been more of an effort to recognize South Korean involvement in the Vietnam War, specifically in academia, and there have also been instances where South Korean officials have expressed their regret of South Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War, though many of these acknowledgments have been informal or not accompanied by official state apologies or reparations. While some forms of South Korean entertainment do try to incorporate this information regarding how South Korea was involved in the Vietnam War, these efforts are limited, though there are talks on how to better integrate this part of history into public consciousness in South Korea. Now, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, please comment your favorite type of Vietnamese pho, and let me know if you knew about South Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to read more about this, as always, all sources in the comments.